We have the pleasure to have with us Professor Georg Lohmann. Professor Lohmann is an emeritus professor at the University of Magdeburg. He's going to present a talk related to this issue entitled 7th-year Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Are we facing a reversion? And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation, of course, and for the friendly hospitality you can experience here. Is my voice loud enough? Okay? Because with the microphone, it's always more difficult. And I will try to read the text, so you can also read it by yourself on the screen if you can't understand my very German English, sorry for this. And I will try sometimes to go over some, skip some, I hope I can tell you. So, introduction. Human rights are not an eternal, absolute idea. They are not discovered, they are made. And they are, like everything that is historical, variable, arise and perish. Their development has never been an unstoppable, linear movement of progress. They are politically deliberate and decisive declarations, settlements, institutions of legal subjective rights arising from different historical contexts and the normative implication of which must and can be justified differently by national law, reasonable law, moral possibility, maybe also theological. Historically and systematically, three conceptions of human rights can be distinguished since the end of the 18th century, and by this one can construct a general concept of human rights. I would say the three conceptions are national ones, international, and possibly transnational ones. From the national conceptions of the late 19th century in North America and in France, we can distinguish an international conception since the foundation of the United Nations. So for more than 70 years now, and that's the topic of the lecture, it has undergone an astonishing development characterized by progress and regression. Recently, however, it has increasingly come under pressure of authoritarian regimes, is hollowed out and selectively weakened, and suffers from foreign and self-produced overburdenings. Thus, the normatively demanding and politically desired third transnational conception of human rights, which can respond to the challenges of globalization and global governments, gets increasingly out of sight. And I don't say anything in this lecture about it. I will first briefly outline the development and differentiation of the international conception. I will then discuss some points of the recent reversion of human rights without claiming completeness, and outline the various threats of human rights today. Finally, I try to give a brief assessment. Second point, on the international conception of human rights. In order to understand this international concept, I must briefly discuss the preceding and following conceptions. So, as a sufficient independent conception, human rights can only be systematically and historically ascertained in the revolutionary democratic national constitution at the end of the 19th century. In North America and in France, the first human rights declaration in connection with the revolutionary founding acts at the same time components of the first modern democratic constitutions. In these national conceptions, as I would like to call them, they tie the political powers, legislative, executive, and the juridical ones, of the newly founded democracies as constitutional civil rights to be observance of civil and human rights, and thus asserts a fundamental and universal claim, which is based in different ways on natural law. In reality, however, they do not satisfy the egalitarian and the universal claims of human rights and exclude, not conceptually but factually, slaves, women, and non-white people to a large extent as bearers of human rights. These national conceptions differ from the current dominant international conception of human rights, which was created after the Second World War by the United Nations within the framework of international law as a component of international law. Skip now something. And this, however, and I will explain it, human rights must be understood not merely as pure moral rights, as they were initially understood by the historical access for contradictory motives, but must now be conceived from the outset in the dimension of politics, law, and morality that cannot be reduced to one another. In the view of the crimes against humanity, justifications of natural law, of the universalization and equalization claims of human rights appeared to be ineffective and discredited and, looking back, were replaced by the newly set and interpreted concept of human dignity. So the concept of human dignity was not used in the national conception of human rights. Doesn't appear, was not used as a founding instance or something else. So it appears in a very interesting process. Now some historians are working about it and also write something about it for totally different, opposite reasons and motives in the international perspective or procedure to develop a declaration of human rights, and also at the beginning of the Charter of the United Nations. It is now used historically for the first time to justify human rights. That explicitly 1966 in the International Covenant in the Civil and the Political Pact. Whatever the concrete motives may be, since the International Human Rights Pact of 1966, human dignity has functioned as a justification for the fact that people who are not citizens of their own must nevertheless be recognized as holders of rights in all states of the world. Human dignity thus gives sovereign states a normative and binding reason under international law to recognize non-citizens as equal holders of rights. The legally equal value status, which the recognition of every human being is or her human dignity, in his or her human dignity, thus guarantees that he or she has rights. So that's totally new. In former times, if a state, a sovereign state, will accept a foreigner or somebody else or a stateless people as a bearer of human rights, it was just related to the contingent interest of the state. So he said, okay, I can do, but I can also withdraw. And now, by self-binding process of international treaty, they say, now from now on, we will accept every human being as a bearer of right. And then, step by step, they recognize because he has an inherent dignity in his person. So it's said in the international treaties. In the same time, however, this represents a step towards a normative further development in the understanding of human rights, which ultimately lead to a new, now transnational and democratic conception of human rights. For the historically new conception of human dignity demands a legal system in which all are not only equal as bearers of rights, but they are all also co-authors of their rights in the same way. Because it is excluded that some of them are only equal subject under the law, and some of them have so added a specific capacity to create law. So that if all have the same position in the bearer of right, then all they have to be not only bearers but also the co-authors. So we have a democratic republican demand in this new interpreted conception of human dignity. And human dignity is a legal concept. It is made and created by political decision put into international treaties. So it's not made by philosophers. So human dignity therefore contains republic or democratic claim as how human rights are to be determined and thus normatively gives far beyond the then and present state of international law and institutions. Nevertheless, one could say with some optimism, human rights are currently within the framework of the international conception in many states of the world, on the one hand, constituted fundamental rights in a more or less democratic community, but also in many authoritarian and dictatorial states. They are not deciphered for what is then called domestic law, but they are now everywhere recognized norms of international law, which also bind non-democratic states, but of course in different ways. So at least North Korea agreed and accepted human rights. And in the Chinese Republic, since 2004, we have a special new paragraph that the Republic of China, the people of China, respect and protect human rights. And China has, of course, ratified a lot of international human rights treaties. Funny enough, China has ratified the Social Pact, not the Political Pact. The United States of America have ratified the Political Pact, but not the Social Pact. And not the International Convention to protect children, because they want to kill children under 16 with death penalty. 16. Okay, come to the next point, progress in relation to international conception. The apparently positive development of international conception are at the same time counteracted by an excess of the good and questionable setbacks or backs in central aspects of the human rights project. However, I can only treat this selectively by addressing some of the features of this complex concept in an explanatory and highly sketchy manner. If you look at the prehistory of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights before and during the Second World War, the Universal Declaration initially appears as an unwanted byproduct of the founding of the United Nations by the victorious powers, which was wrested from them by NGOs in a certain way. In a single, the German author Jan Ecke wrote a famous book about its ambivalence, the student, and shows how funny these processes are. So the main fights, or the main institution fighting against human rights and then also against human dignity was the colonial office in the English ministry. And he's quoting a lot of documents that shows it. Okay? And also the history of the Universal Declaration was, since its legally non-binding proclamation in 1948, had it very difficult to become binding under international law in 1966, was not a straightforward development for the better intended by actors, but a progress made possible by contingent power constellations. For some of them, human rights were only a means of achieving goals contrary to human rights. For others, a non-binding means of asserting their own economic or political interests, and for others, a normative ideal that they could use to determine the injustice and humiliations they had suffered, and as an argumentative weapon in the struggle for political independence, especially in the anti-colonial movements. And finally, for other groups, an idealist normative orientation for the struggle against injustice, arbitrary state power, and also totalitarianism and serious inequalities, which they constituted nearby or distant parts of the world. Despite the contingent emergence and the continuing discontinuous development, however, international human rights can be understood as realizing of practical learning processes in the dimension of morality, law, and politics, the progress of which is, of course, counteracted by constructional defects in the international concept. Analytically, Analytically, these developments can be distinguished from each other in moral, legal, and political respect. In historical reality, they are naturally interwoven. So I come on to the next point. From a moral point of view, human rights appear to be increasingly capable of being justified. And I'm claiming that they have to be justified, but not the rights you have to justify. You have to justify the normative implications that are implicit in saying this and this is right. So you don't justify a concept, you justify the normative implications. The moral justification refers to the normative assertion associated with the human rights that are politically and legally defined by international treaties or national constitutions. In this way, they develop into a global normative yardstick of legitimate state violence. This itself is something historically new, and for the future, the making of a new stage of development behind which, normatively speaking, cannot be reduced without a loss of reason. So it is for the first time that we can measure every political state with the same criteria. We say even you have a dictatorship and so on. But then, of course, it's in public reasoning, what does it mean, and so on and so on. In fact, however, this formal claims of universality, equality, individuality, and categoricity, that meaning that all human beings, as individuals, have the same equal human rights, and they have them because they are human beings and not because they have special properties that gives them a special value and things like that. So it is enough that you are accepted as a being of a human being. So it doesn't mean if you are clever, if you are a handicapped person, mentally ill or something like that. If you are accepted as a human being, and the criteria, if you are accepted as a human being, and if human apes are also human beings, that is not solved by the political decision, it is not solved by the jurist perspective, it's not solved by morality, it is solved by our other well-contested assessment. And then, of course, political decision has to be fixed and say from this on we speak and call this a human being. So if robots and so on will later be accepted as human beings or at the same time, that is an open question. But it is not an argument against this approach. Okay. However, this thesis is in need of explanation. First of all, the normative assertion that are politically set and legally formulated in the human rights document must be morally examined and justified. The structural differences between morality, law, and politics must be taken into account. The political law and the legal definition go back to legitimacy claiming, but ultimately common public decisions in a political community, based on the rule of law or to commissioned instance of the application and enforcement of the law. The morally correct, however, is not based on joint decisions of a moral community, but on convincing reasons in the world of reasons. So it's open possible. What can be accepted as a moral reason in this free and stubborn world cannot be produced or replaced by legal or political decisions. From these moral convictions, which cannot be bound by decisions, the political power and meaning of purely moral concept of human rights is fed. So I'm not saying that the concept of moral rights is just nonsense, like Benson and my friend Georg Lohmann would say. So, no, it has a special, especially political meaning, and it makes a difference if you look at the examples finally, if you understand yourself as an object of moral duties, because we all of us follow a category imperative or something else, or if you understand yourself as a bearer of moral rights, so that others have duties because you are accepted as a bearer of rights. So there's a change in the play and in the institution and things like that, which is much more complicated than I can now just explain. What is claimed to be correct from a moral point of view is immune to political or other objections. Morally justified human rights remain human rights to be claimed, even if they have not been legally enforced or politically or other reasons. Moreover, the moral claim to justification refers not only to the specification and results of political lawmaking or juridical application of law, but also to the progresses of lawmaking and the application of law itself. If one now takes the above-mentioned Republican or democratic content of the newly designed human dignity, according to which the holders of human rights should also be their co-authors, as a normative yardstick for the development of the concept of human rights, the international concept fulfills these claims only in a highly insufficient degree because of its democratic shortcomings. And is also conceptually open whether and how a transnational concept of human rights can fulfill these claims. So I'm discussing here then, of course, Habermas' proposal of conceptualization of international law with the two split sovereignty conception and things like that. So it's on this level, or in this direction. The unbound morally therefore seems to overtax the human rights conception themselves, but in any case, it drives the present forms before it as still capable of improvement. At the same time, however, the demands made on acceptable moral justification have also changed. In the national conception of human rights were founded on natural or rational law and refer to nature or reason as external or vertical instances of justification, as it were with the political legislation beliefs or follows. In the international conception, it appears as if human rights result from the respective interests of sovereign states, which are bound by reciprocal treaties only on the basis of voluntary commitments. This is certainly one of the reasons why models of justification that sound natural law here still appear attractive. So if you look to the covenants, you find natural law using formulations, inherent dignity, everyone is born equal and free, and things like that. So that is the old traditional language of natural law. But it is not used in a natural law sense. So if you look to the protocols of the thing, they say, oh, no natural law argumentation. You see, and then some of the founding fathers of the Reversion Declaration who studied in France and in England, they were personalists and know something, so they say, okay, let's talk about this. In the international concept, it appears this is certainly one of the reasons why the model of justification and sound natural law here still appears attractive, which in a way relate to justification of human rights on an instance beyond the concrete human beings. On the basis of the new reasoning function of human dignity, one can, however, make clear that only now horizontal models of reasoning are appropriate, because the fundamental equivalence of all human beings excludes that only some set and justify human rights, even if they were set by equal for all. I skip the rest and go to the next point. From a legal point of view, there are a number of crucial extensions to the early national conception of human rights. The scope of rights is no longer limited to liberties and some political rights, but has been extended and include economic, social, and cultural rights. Initially, these social rights were treated as second-class rights, and the special treatment in the social pact showed that the duties associated with them are placed, so to speak, at the disputation of national sovereignty. Furthermore, so it says in both convents, the first paragraph is that the people have the right of self-determination. That is the result of the colonial decolonization process, but also the old treaty partners of the United Nations had a very much strong interest that sovereignty and national self-determination comes first, and then human rights. But in fact, human rights change this meaning of sovereignty. To the extent, however, that they are increasingly perceived as rights, corresponding to negative and positive obligations. So now the duties that are related to them are no longer negative duties, but also, after Henry Schuh had shown it explicitly, positive duties to help or fulfill and to protect. The legal obligation associated with them become normatively undeniable, and the challenge for national and transnational regulation. And the LOCs of human rights are first the state where you are a member of. Then, if this state could not fulfill this duty, then all the other states of the treaty. And then all states have the duty to show in horizontal effect, in German we call it Drittwirkung, that human persons in their civil relations respect human rights, but in the way Kant is saying that you are respecting law, by saying that just your outer observable behavior should be fit to the norms of the law. It's not that you have to change your opinion and so on. Parallel to this expansion of the normative content of human rights, a large number of international regional human rights conventions are now being adopted, which promote differentiation and specification of human rights standardization. I skip the next paragraph because that is much more. You can know that we have extensions also in the mechanism of protecting human rights. We have a process by which we develop step by step regional and then international court, first ad hoc, then general ones. We have now an international criminal court and things like that, which of course is not binding all nations, but those who are partners in this, and so on. So one can develop and show this development in global law. Here the international law of human rights mixes with different variants of soft law and civil legal regimes of international companies and actors. The generally established legal pluralism at the global level is a particular challenge for human rights protection, ranging from the traditional International Labour Organization to voluntary use of responsibility, such as the Global Compact, and attempts to create direct human rights obligations also for international companies. That, of course, is in the discussion. On the whole, an increasingly comprehensive and differentiated production of legal norms contrasts with astonishing developments in the institution of law enforcement and control, which remain weak, selective, and opportunistically dependent on the decisions of sovereign states and or have inadequate means of sanctions. So there's lots of things to do to make it better, but if you look back and 10 years before, when 60 years anniversary of the Human Rights Declaration were discussed, everybody said, oh, what a great thing, even in this direction. So development from pure moral claims to legally binding international law and rights, and then you have step by step the right for individual claiming if you feel that the human right is violated, you think that you have reports, you have international commissioners, and things like that. You have a lot of public pressure via the political, of course, institutions to protect and to realize human rights. So now, last point from a political point of view, the transformation process of state sovereignty is certainly astonishing, albeit controversial development of progress. Even when the United Nations was formed, the classical Westphalian concept of sovereignty was stricted in its formulation, but the gradually established international control of domestic human rights protection not only restricts the classical competence of sovereignty inwardly, but also transforms the concept of sovereignty itself. And I skip here also the whole paragraph. So, you can read it, but just to, I would like to come to the end. Because you all know the deficits. We have a Security Council that is, I mean, you see, normally it has to be under the respect and the control of human rights. So every institution of the United Nations should be also under the rule of human rights. And there is now some steps in this because we have troops of UN forces in Africa and also in former Yugoslavia who are now charged by not following human rights norms. So that for the first time. Because in former times they say, oh, we want to make some treaties with the local authorities that we are immune and we can do what we want and nobody takes care. This is one reason why the United Nations of America didn't join the international criminal law. First they were supporting it, and then they realized, oh, that means that our soldiers also could be put before this court, so therefore we want to get rid of it. So, however, all these developments are highly ambivalent. So that's the last. Paradoxically, they are powerful because of their force needed to limit themselves essentially to moral peace and naming, blame, and shaming. That is the development of international of public sphere. So we have a network of public spheres, regional ones, national ones, but also international ones. They are, of course, as you know, they can do something good, but only for a short time. They need the international media to appeal to people and things like that. They have no democratic legitimation. Once they do, their own legitimation they have that they argue in a proper way and things like that. So it's a very good thing, but on the other hand, it is just for short actions. But on the other hand, it's not so bad. And if you see it, I will come to the Reversion province. They have a strong political power. What it demands its strength in one respect is another. It requires its supplementation or inclusion in yet to be developed forms of global strong political spheres. When one speaks of a strong public sphere becoming, as Humboldt was saying, starting from the strengthening human rights culture on a global level, seems perhaps too optimistic in view of the above-mentioned renationalization tendencies in the world politics. But with these considerations, which were ultimately summary and highly cursory, we have perhaps now reached a stage where we can ask whether, in view of these complex, differentiated, faltering and contradictory developments in the international concept of human rights, we could speak of progress in human rights, and if so, why? Now, when solemn speeches were made 10 years ago on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the Human Rights Declaration, the tenor was mostly astonishing, as I have said. Few people feared that almost all the achievements of human rights policy that were generally agreed upon could be so radically questioned, disregarded, and changed for the worse. I am not so much interested here, also that is of course the decisive thing, the actual increase of human rights crimes in the world. For the empirical questions, the reports of Amnesty International and other NGOs are relevant. What interests me here is whether and how the international conception of human rights itself is weakened. undermined, and regressed. And that seems to be what we look into the world is telling us. I would like to express this clarification, one after the other, from a political, legal, and moral perspective. Political deformation in neo-authoritarian regimes. Just after the colonization, there was a hope after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the brief glow of the Arab Spring that the new states could and must now be democratically formed. As we now see, this has only been achieved in a few cases in a stable manner, and in most cases, authoritarian regimes, dictatorship dressed up in religious dress or unstable state structures have established themselves. That alone is a cause for concern. What is worse, however, from the perspective of human rights, is the creeping erosion and transformation of established democracies into authoritarian state regimes made possible by former democracy, which then construct their own alleged human rights in order to give themselves the appearance of political legitimacy. In order to do this, at the beginning of the usurpation, they restrict the freedom of the public media, manipulate them into their interest, and restrict freedom of opinion and assembly, and pursue or suppress opposition. These classical human and civil rights are constitutive and fundamental for a well-functioning democracy. Like Ronald Rock was showing that the right of freedom of speech is a constitutive right for a good functioning democracy if you have a majority rule. So that gives the minority a reason to hold and to follow the majority laws and signal. So that's very important. These classical human and civil rights are therefore constituted and should and therefore be included, I would suggest, in the catalogue of human rights in the state of emergence. I wrote a paper about this. So why not put the right of freedom of expression? In German we would say Notstandsfest. So it could not be reduced in a situation of emergency. At the same time, the renaturalization of politics, xenophobia, and criminalization of domestic and international NGOs had defended human rights, led to internal and external criticism being weakened, defamed, or excluded. So, Orban, Putin, Erdogan, and so on. And I think, as I heard, a lot of also South American states show the same kind of policy. Once a sufficient majority has been achieved, constitutional amendments will abolish the separation of powers under the rule of law and weaken constitutional control and make it absurd. These political mechanisms and strategies of creeping, legally formally correct transformation of former democracies into authoritarian regimes are also made possible by a particularity of human rights and show a systematic weakness of human rights. Human rights are subjective rights, I would say, normatively of public law, not of private law. And therefore they are not themselves connected with moral, enforceable duties to use these rights perfectly in the sense of a good democracy. They are bound to the structure of formal subjective law, which can only assume and demand freedom from arbitrariness for the exercise of rights, not wise, common good, and morally determined will decisions. So they are not bound to moral will, they are bound to, in Kantian sense, to other, to willkür. And willkür is not only freedom of choice. Kant says willkür is not freedom of choice, it is something different. It is, I would say, just an arbitrary kind of will decision. On the one hand, this is, in my opinion, a strength of human rights, and no reason to feign them as such, as Christopher Menck and others do. But it shows that human rights themselves depend on, as Almas would say, accommodating cultural ways of life, and thus are historically controversial and not, once established, absolutely resistant to change. The result of these political reversion processes is a weakening of the international character of human rights, a revision of strict non-interference claims of traditional state sovereignty in order to be able to enforce domestic human rights restrictions undisturbed as a legally politically desired by election. This associated with a withdrawal from international human rights control mechanisms and monetary procedures ultimately form international treaties. So I think the result of all these processes I mentioned here is that the international control by human rights of a specific state becomes weakened, and so if you look what they do, all these new creations of authoritarian regime, first they try to weaken the power of international finance or supported NGOs. They cut international communication media, Facebook and so on, and things like that. So, and then they try to develop their own specific construction of public sphere and things like that. So now the legal information, equalization of law. With the political intended abolition of democratic legislation and the separation of powers, human rights lose their necessary constitutional democratic visualization and control. They fall back to the status of rights constituted under private law. Now we can say that international law already has a structure under private law, and that human rights treaties, because they are treaties, are exposed to all the weakness of private law. And I just will follow here Kant's critique of private law. But the intention after 1945 was an anti-totalitarian, democratic renewal of state power, because this seems to be the only way to believe and to reach that international peace can be secured. And the binding nature of human rights under international law should support, promote, and control this process from within and from beyond. Now this internal democratic control seems to be dwindling or changing in the states as well. Now reinterpreted as private law within the state, human rights are open to purely economic reinterpretation and instrumentalization and are used in the same way. Now human rights are regressing to voluntary mutual promises and made according to interest, which are kept or not kept according to private advantage. These reinterpretations also serve as a model for the question of how to deal with international companies. In this sense, many of them calculate the observance and the violation of human rights according to the costs that this causes or entails, and not according to the independent legal judgment that and whether it is necessary or prohibited. So they have a very strong approach if you look for global competency, not to use the already there legal binding structures of the International Labour Organization and so on. No, they say, no, we want to do it for private, free responsibility. So the concept of responsibility that is used here, it is replacing a strong binding effect of legally binding duties. So that is very interesting. They say responsibility means always freely responsible, and not that they are strong and no sanctions and so on. At the same time, this economization is accompanied by the weakening of the obligation character of human rights. Instead of enforcing the sanctuary legal obligation, there is talk of voluntary responsibility, or that's what I just said. Okay? More could be added into this legal change and weakening, but I want and have for time reason to leave that at this for this. So go to the next one. Moral deformations, reculturalization, rejection of the individual character of human rights, and reinterpretation of contents, selection, and weakness. In the area of moral deformation of human rights, this is in a broad sense. I also include those accepts in which philosophers allegedly believe critically but postmodernly that human rights, and I quote, are amputated by that human beings are amputated by human rights in their humanity. German author Reversion. Or produce only injustice, boundaries, or domination in their form. In an uncritical follow-up of Marx's critique of human rights, they believe that human rights themselves who caused capitalist exploitation and domination. And I wrote a critique to this approach. Of course, human rights are being abused very often. And the former colonies, for example, have a rich and perverse experience which domination, exploitation, which supposedly could be legitimized by human rights. So if you look in the middle of the 19th century, and then also in the beginning of the 20th century, where the colonies started to fight against the colonial states, they tried to legitimize their practice. First they say, oh, you are a different kind of race, so lower, and we are the better white race, and so they have a racistic argumentation. And then they, because the argumentation of racistic becomes criticized by himself, then they are talking about development. And then they say, we have the duty to develop. We are an underdeveloped state, and therefore, you see, so they are using this. And then one can see that they are still using human rights, and not really human rights, they are using the formal law structure. English especially, the Portuguese, as far as I know, not so much. So maybe that is one of the reasons why in Brazil we have a lot of difficulties to develop a strong formal conception of law system. But the English do, did. But for those who were colonized, it was just a misuse of legal norms to dominate. So from their traditional historic experience, they have not a good experience with law and with rights. So therefore it's not so astonishing that they are very skeptical about this kind of human rights declaration by saying, hey, and the anti-colonial fights, they were not using human rights. Sometimes they do, but there are specific reasons. They were much more talking about dignity because they experienced the decolonization as a humanization and a violation of their dignity, even if they had traditional conception of dignity. So dignity becomes a much more important political need for them than human rights. Then to change afterwards. So it's an interesting process how this dialectic, one would say, happened. It would actually be an inner philosophical relevant debate if it did not throw away the philosophical possibilities to fend. Sorry. Of course, human rights were misused. And I am against position that try to show that human rights themselves are something that created domination, unfreedom, and injustice, and so on. So this, I think, by this we are weakening our position, and we just give up any, I would say, reasonable norms for which we can rely when we want to fight for, let's say, emancipation or whatsoever. So some, not all, Islamic position doubt the universal opportunity. These objections are, of course, launched. Okay, I think I have to start this one. This would actually only be an inner philosophical relevant debate if it did not throw away the philosophical possibilities to defend the morally justifiable character of human rights, their universal, egalitarian, individual, and categorical claims, instead of weakening, dissolving, or restricting them by an elite, religion, or cultural counterposition or preconditions. These objections are, of course, launched by politically interested parties, but as such they are of philosophical moral relevance. So some, not all, Islamic positions doubt the universal egalitarian character, understood law as given by God, and then only in the form as it is stated in the Sharia principles related to equality and inclusion. And Chinese official bodies want to recognize individual rights only under the condition of prior fulfillment of community obligations. Also from the African context, such culturally justified interpretation as weakness of essential morally justifiable claims to individual bearers of human rights can decide. So there is now a broader discussion that the concept of individuality is much too bound to liberal European tradition, and the concept of individuality in the African context means that you are, as an individual, bind to your successors and your predecessors, and that you have some kind of community in your kind of individuality. To the extent that these political supported positions succeed in making certain memberships in clans, religious communities, nations, etc., or just postmodern romanticization of communal moral practices, in condition for the condition of human rights, for the possession and exercise of human rights, they rear away the brittle, universal and egalitarian claim of human rights. Then it is not the horizontal community of all individual human beings that decide on the bearing and content of human rights, but the mostly hierarchically determined order of the communities whose membership now confers rights. That I would say is the left behind 1776. So one has to be very cautious if in human rights context people are using the concept of family. Because family, in their understanding, are hierarchical orders. The father is dominated, and the brother about the son, and so on. So, once the barriers of impartial justification of human rights have been crossed, individual human rights can now also be interpreted in terms of content. The individual right to freedom of religion is now to become a right of religion, however it may be, to be protected as such. So in the recent debates in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, or the human right to change a religion means free entry to, into, but not exit from a religious community. The right of freedom of opinion, of expression, is to be restricted or modified by community obligation. Remember the Universal Declaration of Human Duties. They say, okay, everybody has the right to freedom of expression, but only if you first fulfill the duties against the community. And now, hold on and hope not to despair. Because this was, of course, without any footnote. No, is it not? Okay, because I have one version where I have a list of the literature I was referring to. And of course, like it is every time with me, it's only my own application. So if you want, you can just read. Thank you.
So we are perfect in time, and we can start
discussing the paper, the talk presented by Professor Lohmann. Please, the floor is open. Alessandro, Corinne, Nita, Kenneth, and you. Okay, Alessandro, go first.
Thank you very much. It was an impressive vision of what human rights have become. And I would like to ask you two questions about the first part and the second part. The first part, when you talk about human rights as moral rights, and you say that they are not grounded through decisions or factual concept, but through convincing reason. And I don't want to be postmodern, but nevertheless I would like to ask first, whom should be convinced? Who should be convinced by this reason? Because of course, I don't think that we're thinking of every human being, but so who are the people who are supposed to be convinced through this moral grounding? And secondly, how? So that is, what counts as a convincing reason? In a sense, this is the same problem that also Habermas discourse at face. What counts as a convincing reason? So, for instance, if you discuss with this, with the representative of the position that you mentioned at the end, the cultural view, etc., what counts as a convincing reason for you might not count for a convincing reason of them, under the idea that what you defend as universal is just a way of denying their character or cultural parallelism. I'm not advocating this, but I think you need really to give a stronger answer than just say, well, they make human rights weaker. The second, what do you intend precisely under economization of human rights? I find this very interesting because this is something I wanted to mention also in my paper. Maybe I won't do it if you did it already. In the sense that more and more they have become just a way to ask for compensation. So it seems that the only real human right is a right for compensation that can be. Is this what you mean by the decolonization of human right?
Thanks, Alessandro. Now, well, if you don't mind, we try to group three issues, three questions. So, Corinne.
Yeah, thank you, Georg. I was also really impressed. And my point is similar to Alessandro's first point, I think, because we have been discussing about a moral and a political version of human rights, but what you then refer to in the last part of your paper as moral human rights, and they, go into this trap, like you mentioned then postmodernists and such person. I'd say, well, it's rather your political notion that goes into that trap, because, I mean, they then make all these arrangements in order to include everyone. And another moral version would exactly, remain very individualistic and not, become culturalistic or refer to group rights and all that. So that was, maybe it's a question of terminology, but maybe it goes deeper, because I would defend, let's say, the Kantian moral version of human rights.
Thanks. Going to conclude for the first round, Nitama.
Thank you, Professor Lohmann. It was a very interesting presentation. My question is also related to the other two, except that since you mentioned this colloquium on progress, I was wondering what you would make of the fact that for post-colonial or the studies or for the idea of decolonization, we are of course making normative claims for social change, and therefore there is some assumption that there might be some kind of a moral progress. So I was wondering whether in your international conception of human rights, what kind of moral progress you could take into account in your conception.
Thanks. Then we have a second round.
Okay. Yeah, maybe I just try to do this with this. So, thank you, of course, very much for the questions. Maybe I take together the questions that are dealing with what is meant with moral rights and so on. So, I said from the concept and in all three conceptions, human rights are legal rights, subjective legal rights. If they are legal rights, they are part of positive law. Therefore, they have to be created settled by political communities, either parliament or international treaty communities and things like that. So they are made by and via political decisions, and they got a legal form. They are legal rights, not moral rights. And then, of course, I have a theory what is the difference between moral right and legal right and so on. And I would say, with Habermas, that the concept of right comes in this area from the legal conception of right. And then, of course, we have, if you look to the history, very complex development, what is the concept of right. So the first development of this kind of right was developed by the late scholastic Jesuits in Spain by saying that the domination and the misuse of people here in South America are unjust because these people have, just by their nature, so was the argumentation, natural rights. There were subjective natural rights because that is only made to every human being as a single being, not because they are a member. They are a member of the same humankind as the Spanish. Therefore, you see, then of course there is a funny development. Some of them, like Molina, are using it to say that cruel violations to treat slaves are not justified, but to make slaves was justified. So that was step by step, but it comes by this, and sometimes Ockham has also something. So in this tradition, and then Pufendorf and others, they develop step by step a concept of a right, where the bearer of a right is a single person. Then, of course, with different explanation and formulation, what does it mean? And then, in the German tradition, and I'm not so much I don't know much about the English and the American tradition. There's much more this common law tradition. In the German tradition, in the 19th century, there was then a new interpretation of this concept of right, by using more or less a private interpretation, by saying the right is just, and then you have these two kinds of interpretation, interest theories or will theories of right. The right is either a claim or it is just protection of interest and things like that. And then we discuss what are the... so, I mean, I have to make a short answer to won't give a long answer. So, I mean, I'm referring to this tradition. And then, of course, I would say, when it comes to the formulation of the first national declarations of human rights, they were using the concept of right in this specific understanding, as I would say, following now the French tradition with Rousseau, as rights that are made into the public sphere. In the public sphere, the public. In the English, not so much. Sometimes I have the idea that the English, they understand human rights very much as political rights, but they are interpreting the political body as a private affair, made by private treaties. So they have a private law interpretation of the public law. And in the Rousseauian tradition in France, we have a much more republic, I would say now, also democratic tradition. So if it is like this, then you have a specific right only if you are a recognized member of a legal community that is made by a political community that you must to be a citizen to be a bearer of a right. I think that then you have not only a passive but also an active right and so on. So this is all put into the legal conception of human rights. And then if you are, and then with the right, it means you have the possibility to go to court, and there are, if somebody is violating the rights, You have the ability to ask institutions for sanctions and so on. With the right, I would say in the Kantian sense, the Zwang, the coercion, is a definite element of having the right. And also that you can go to court, to the public, and so on. If you are talking now about pure moral rights, then you can't go to court. What you can do is to appeal to the public and say, hey, blaming, shaming, and so on, somebody is violating my, I would say, now moral right. And there are no external sanctions. You just can sanction others in the sense of two letters saying by blaming, shaming, and so on. So I would say moral rights are, if you compare them with legal rights, weak rights. But they have a very important political meaning. Because if you understand yourself as a bearer of rights, you are understanding yourself in a much more, I would say, developed way. And then, of course, it comes to the justification. What has to be justified are the normative implications of this conception. So we have to justify why all human beings should have the same equal rights. You don't justify the concept. I mean, you don't justify what is a stool, what is a desk. So we justify not concepts, we justify the normative implications. And also we have to justify why should be the bearer of a right only an individual and not a community. Because in formal law, modern law of course, community can be constructed as persons and as bearers of rights, so a single law. So there is no problem. So companies, of course, are acting as bearers of rights and so on. So with human rights, there is a political decision that only natural individuals in their corporate way of living are the bearers of rights. That is, I would say, just a political decision, and it is motivated by the experiences, but because all the brutalities that happen in totalitarian, colonial, and so on dominations, they, in the last end, violate individuals. Of course, also destroy norm structures and similar. But in the last end, what was violated are individuals. So I would say human rights are specific protection, legal institutions, to protect individuals, not communities. And they protect, of course, individuals in their basic needs and so on, and also in their, for their life, necessary community relations. But it always has to go via the protection of the individual. So you can't say that you have to. So therefore I would say, and this of course must be justified. And then I would say, if it comes to this different cultural tradition, first also, there was one question to your office. It seems to me that sometimes we are mixing an empirical conception of public reasoning with the normative ones. You see? So if you are talking about public reasoning in Afghanistan, you have an empirical understanding of public reasoning. And if you are talking about global public reasoning, more or less, then you can also have an empirical one, see what is really global discussion at the moment, and where's the place where it takes place, and so on. But on the other hand, we have an idealized construction, what's in the world of reasons, good reasons and not. And then, of course, we get all the philosophical problems to decide what are convincing reasons and so on. And I would say with Habermas, there is no, as I said, you can't decide by political or by other decisions what is a convincing reason. It's just open. And my strategy is to use here a normative principle of impartiality. So I'm not using discourse ethics. Of course, one can of course say that discourse ethics is an expression of this concept of impartiality, but it seems to me impartiality is much weaker. So we are using a weak principle to evaluate argumentation and justification on this level, in this field. And then with the principle of impartiality, that the funny thing is that it doesn't claim that only universality and equality is a good reason. It goes for universalization and egalitarianism, so it is a negative functional principle. If you are talking about what are impartially acceptable reasons or assessments, then you say as long as there are no other reason I see, then I'm arguing for. And then you are arguing against the opposite opposite assertion. So if somebody says, no, we want not that all human beings are bearers of human rights, but this, then you have to argue against it. And if you can show them that it is. So you are changing the burden of proof. And the first one who explained this was Kuhler also, but others I quoted, but it doesn't matter. So maybe is there, I would say with two that there is, it seems to me there is a social that there is a progress in the standards of what is a good justification, what is good reason. And by this we are now aware that all reasonings are bind into more or less strong evaluations. And then, of course, we are criticizing these evaluations by this principle of impartiality. So the principle of impartiality is subtle. It also makes a strong evaluation as, let's say, limiting the fields of reasons by saying this and this is not proper. So, for instance, if it is said women are just by nature determined only by feeling and therefore not by reason, therefore they couldn't vote. You see? And that seems for a lot of people self-evident, this evaluation proposal. And then of course we say no, this, and then we destroy it. As long as we have no other reasons. The same with, if we have good reasons that human apes have to be respected in the same way, then we include them. And as long as not, they are not genuine bearers of human rights. They could be bearers of simple law, of course. Simple.
Okay. Then we have the question by Professor Baynes, and then so Kenneth, and then Suzanne.
Yeah, thank you, Georg. I'm probably so much in sympathy with what you're attempting to do here that again I'll try to be the devil's advocate. It seemed to me the first move that you just repeated is we don't try to justify the idea of a right, we try to justify the normative implications of the right. That sounds convincing to me at one level, but then you made a second step that seems to me much more controversial, and it was expressed in two ways. One, you said we have to understand the holders of rights also to be the co-authors of rights. Right? That is, whoever's a bearer of rights is also a co-author of rights. Now, it's going to raise all kinds of questions of who could these bearers be that also could be co-authors. And related to that, right, another interesting metaphor you used is this shift from a vertical model of reasoning, which you call the natural law view, probably Kantian views as well, to a horizontal model of reasoning. That sounds to me like not whether you have a human right to democracy, but whether we need a democratization of human rights. So the idea would be now, right, we have those human rights that we can justify to the human community through some kind of very abstract democratic process. It's very close to discourse ethics. You wanted to step back, but it's hard for me to imagine that that's not what it would lead to or what it becomes. And that's another comprehensive view. It's another comprehensive moral theory. if you're not a Rawlsian or a Rawlsian, but a Scanlonian or a Habermasian. That's just as much a comprehensive moral theory and not a political. And so I raise that as I'm fascinated by the proposal. I think I'm in sympathy with the proposal, but it seems to me it has an uphill battle.
So Susanna, to conclude.
Well, thank you for the presentation. I would like to raise one concern. I think that you painted quite a distorted picture in terms when you presented the political threat of human rights, or where they are declining, because you highlighted only neo-authoritarian regimes, and I think that your interpretation was quite geopolitically biased, because you really omitted, on the one hand, obvious, critique of USA, which is not a new, but also European Union countries, when there is this case of around transnational migration, the externalization of border zones, and outsourcing of border management, which is interpreted by many as a violation of human rights and an effort to avoid the human rights commitment. And well, you may say that you agree with these suggestions, but I think if you don't present it, if you don't include it in your diagnosis of the state of human rights, that it's a serious, well, it points to a serious problem of the outlook we chose to present.
What is not included?
Well, the critique of so-called democratic states. The threat of to human rights does not come only from non-Western so-called neo-authoritarian regimes.
Yeah, right. Thank you, of course, very much for. I'm always looking for the weak points, and of course there are a lot of weak points. So you are dealing with the same point to some extent. I wrote some essays by saying that there is an unresolved Republican content in human rights, also in this new concept of dignity. So the Republican content is not, I distinguish three kinds of dignity conceptions. Social conceptions of dignity, some have this kind of dignity like the dignity of a professor or the dignity of an honest person and things like that. And then we have a general or universal conception of dignity where you have specific reasons, either like in Cicero, the ability for intellectual capacities and things like that. Cicero has both, he has social, particular and more universal conception, like Pico della Mirandola, Thomas Aquinas, Mark D, Till, Kant, and so, and they are all referring, as you did, to a specific property that is high evaluated and gives human beings a specific status, now a status higher than animals. The other conception is also a high evaluated specific status, but in relation to other human beings, other persons. And these two conceptions of dignities, they are combined with duties against oneself. They are not combined with having rights, sometimes with privileges, and they are compatible with social inequalities. But after the Second World War, this new conception, new interpretation of dignity, that is a legal conception, and of course legal means it is politically made. You see, they just define what they understand, and then the professional jurists explain what is the meaning of this concept of dignity. And it is smuggled into the international covenant. Because first it said in the Charter of the United Nations that everybody is born free and equal with dignity and freedom and so on. So dignity is on the level of the same values. And then the international covenants in 1666, now dignity becomes a founding basis for having human rights. So it becomes a proper situation. And if you look to the European development, in the first European Human Rights Declaration, the concept of dignity didn't appear, which is astonishing. But then in the Human Rights Charter, where the German Roman Herzog was a leading figure in creating and writing it, the concept of dignity has nearly the same position, dominant position, like in the German Grundgesetz. So, and the English, of course, always argued against this. They want to understand dignity just as a nice value, where you can orientate or not. You see? They say, no, it's much stronger. And then you have, if you look to the European jurists who interpret it, they say, of course, we have either a value, then we have as a principle, then we have as a specific human rights, which of course is just for systematic reason difficult. So, if it is this, they didn't talk about what I call the Republican or democratic content of this concept. It is what I approach it, and I relate it to Kant. Because the first time when Kant is using the concept of dignity in the Grundlage, he is using it in explaining Reich der Zwecke, realm of ends, and then he says for the first time when he's using the concept of dignity, the ability, Tauglichkeit, to follow only those laws that you give, and then one could explain in brackets with others together, that is your dignity. So the members of the realm of ends have dignity, and the Oberhaupt must not have dignity. The text says in one point something different. So, but so I would say Kant is a very good starting point, even if you don't have our conception of human rights and not using this concept. So Kant for the first time says, in the concept of dignity, there is a Republican Rousseauan understanding of common allgemeine Gesetzgebung. So, and this is of course the reason, because if you have allgemeine Gesetzgebung, then it has to be that everybody is on the same level. That is mean horizontal. And if its law is made by an instance above, then you have a vertical. So that's the idea. And now, and then I would say that if you take together all the political rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it comes out a democratic process of making and controlling political power. So of course the authoritarian states didn't want to say it, the Soviet Union didn't want to say explicitly, but what in fact comes out. So I would say there is no explicit right for democracy, but you just sum up everything, then it comes out. So that's what. And then I would say the last question, the last answer to your question. If one has to decide, one always has to decide. I mean, different rights. You see, the diversity of human rights are different answers, contingent answers to specific dangers and brutalities humans experience. So they are not made out just for one point. And so it's totally contingent and so on. So if you look to the history, some of them are there, then not. So it develops step by step, but not in a systematic way. So you have to argue what kind of human rights, what kind of content is so important that we have formulated as on the basis of human rights. Like for instance now, should there be a human right to water? Or to information self-determination and so on. This is then we discuss new issues, and then of course that goes in conflict with the human right to property, freedom of others, and so on. And then there has to be a process of balancing, and for this we are using public decision in a good functioning democracy. So I would say, as you asking, if you have a good moral reason, fine. But then you have to go with your good moral reason to the public sphere, and try to find a majority in the relevant political system, so that your good, reasoned, normative, moral ground become a public decision. So that is this, I would say, the transformation of willing process to decision process, institutional. Of course, that is very optimistic, but what I want to say is that in the concept of human rights, the concept, and also in the conception to some extent, this is normatively implied. And I have to argue for this, of course, and not by saying, okay, you can just make human rights just out of private interests. And I have to argue why this is not convincing. And I have to argue why it is not only a result of moral justification and so on. And of course, as a human right, everything should be ended. Thank you very much.